Good morning. My name is Michael Conley, and I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Finance and Operations for the North Reading Public Schools. And today we're going to take a look at the FY fiscal year 2025 school budget, and particularly look at the Chapter 70 state funding program and what that means for North Reading in terms of state revenue and the budget process. So the state budget was released about a month ago in January. Its Chapter 70 had a $263 million increase, which was about a 4% increase over fiscal year 2024. The state budget also continued to implement the Student Opportunities Act, which we are currently in year 4 of what was a 6-year plan to increase Chapter 70 state aid funding towards Massachusetts school districts. The Student Opportunities Act is geared mostly towards assisting those communities that have the highest need, largest achievement gaps, and highest population of economic disadvantaged students. The majority of those efforts of the Student Opportunities Act is to increase the foundation budget, which is the minimum level of providing a fair and adequate education for local school districts, mostly by changing the way 5 budget categories were functioning, and the biggest being certainly items like healthcare costs, in making special education costs, and making the annual increases of benefits, healthcare, special education that are behind the foundation budget calculation more in line with actual increases. So the adjusted calculations involve both in and out of district special education costs. The annual rate increases and the formula have increased to more accurately reflect actual costs and trends in this area. So it was certainly a commitment to increase funding by a significant amount over a 6-year period through the Chapter 70 formula. And the governor budget is continuing on this initiative to fully fund the Student Opportunities Act. So that is also included. The minimum aid per pupil funding was set at $30 per pupil, and we'll get into that in a moment and see how that's impacting North Reading. So the state budget is out there. The next steps is that we'll go to the House and then to the Senate and to the Conference Committee, and it really won't officially be approved until mid to late June. For more information on the state budget, you can certainly go on the Max Taxpayers website and take a look. So here's the Chapter 70 formula in Massachusetts, and we can certainly look at it and talk about what are the main steps in calculating a district's Chapter 70 aid. Well, step 1 is the foundation budget is calculated each district, which represents, again, the minimum spending level needed to provide an adequate education. It's adjusted each year to reflect changes in enrollment, changes in student demographics, grade levels, economic status, English language proficiency, what your student demographic data is, as well as inflation, which I think are the 2 main factors, your enrollment and inflation, on driving the district's foundation budget. So step 1 is you calculate a district's foundation budget. Step 2 is you calculate what the community can afford, and that would be the local contribution requirement. So how much of that foundation budget should be paid for by each city or town's property tax based on really the relative wealth of that community. So that's step 2. And if everything is kind of in line and functioning adequately, how the formula wants things to function, the difference of your foundation and your local contribution requirement, what you can afford, becomes your state aid. And that's the funding necessary to reach their foundation, or again, the mandated minimum level of education. So the Chapter 70 formula is not a one-size-fits-all. The goal is to ensure that every district has sufficient resources to meet its foundation budget spending level through an equitable combination of local property taxes, the relative wealth of that community, and then state aid. So the local required contribution plus state aid should equal a district's net school spending requirement, and that minimum amount that a district must spend to comply with state law. So most districts, including North Reading, do spend more than the minimum on average by 20%. And we'll see some data later in this presentation that kind of illustrates that. In North Reading, in the most previous year, fiscal 23 last year, that we have actual data on, spent about 35% more than the minimum net school spending requirement. So let's get into the numbers on Chapter 70 for North Reading. You can kind of look at the data that's out there. You can see, again, the enrollment, the foundation enrollment, which is the number of students that North Reading is financially responsible for, going down by 9 students. You can look at the foundation budget and the difference between fiscal 24 and 25. And then the required district contribution, again, what the community can afford. And then the Chapter 78. So the required net school spending amount is also listed. So in the case of North Reading, we're sort of a minimum aid community. So our target aid share is 17.5%, which is the minimum amount, which essentially attempts to say no community should really be looked to contribute anything less than 17.5%. But the percent of our Chapter 70 compared to our foundation budget in North Reading is much higher than our target aid share, as you can see, between a little over 25%, and what is our target, which is 75%. So the reason why that kind of dynamic is in place is the reason why our net school spending requirement is much greater than our foundation budget, by about, almost a little under $1 million. $1 million. So in the eyes of the formula, North Reading is receiving about $1 million more in Chapter 70 than it should, which is why North Reading does default to just the minimum aid $30 per pupil increase, as opposed to having a much larger increase in Chapter 70 aid. And this has been the case in North Reading for a great number of years, as you can see. So the $67,800 increase from Chapter 78 in fiscal 25 over 24 is driven by the $30 minimum aid amount multiplied by our foundation enrollment, 2,260. So because in the eyes of the formula, we're getting more Chapter 78 than they think we should, because our percent of our Chapter 70 aid is much greater than our target, 25.5 compared to 17.5. North Reading is not going to qualify for additional Chapter 70 aid beyond the minimum amount. And the districts are kind of held harmless to the previous year's level of Chapter 78. So we're not going to receive less than last year. We're going to receive the minimum. And this dynamic for North Reading most likely is going to play out over a large number of years, which it has been in the past, because of that dynamic at play, the difference of our target aid share and our actual amount, the 17.5 and the 25.5. So again, districts receive different levels of Chapter 78 because their municipality's, city or town's ability to pay differs. So in the case of North Reading, the required local contribution is equal to about 76%, and the amount of state aid is equal to about 24%. It's almost a 75-25% split. The formula wants North Reading to be at 17.5%. So we are well above our target, And as I said earlier, we're not qualifying for large Chapter 70 increases because of that dynamic at play. Where in this chart, Stoneham and Westwood are also 17.5% minimum aid communities, like many communities in the Commonwealth are, but they are at their target. So they're subject to larger state aid increases from year to year because of that dynamic. So you can kind of see where some of these communities fall. Here's our local contribution. If you look at this chart as it relates to North Reading, you can see that the foundation budget certainly has been growing each year. It's taken larger increases since the Student Opportunities Act went into place. So every foundation budget has been increasing. Our Chapter 78 has been pretty stagnant. It hasn't increased significantly over the last number of years because we're only qualifying for the minimum aid amount. And our actual or required net school spending, the dotted line, is currently a little bit above our foundation budget because, again, the formula thinks we're getting more of the Chapter 70 aid than we should. And our actual is even greater than what our requirement is. So again, North Reading is not unlike many other communities in the Commonwealth who all spend more than they're required. That is a very common statistic, so we're not unlike many communities across the Commonwealth. If you look at this chart here, as I said earlier, we're spending on average about 30% more than other districts than what we're required to spend. And there's 129 other school districts in Massachusetts that are also in that same threshold of that 120 to 150% more than what they're required to do. And there's several other districts that are even greater than that. So we are very much like many districts across Massachusetts in terms of spending more than what we're required. Because again, keep in mind, the foundation budget is meant to represent a minimum threshold. The Student Opportunities Act has done an exceptional job in increasing areas of expense categories like benefits, special education that have grown exponentially higher than your average inflationary increases. And that's a goal of the Student Opportunities Act, and that dynamic is at play, which is helping this scenario. But again, many districts do spend more than they're required to spend. I mentioned earlier that North Reading is a minimum aid community, and that for many years now, going back to fiscal 13, we've been a minimum aid community that we've only seen the $30 or whatever the amount per pupil has been set at by the state budget increases in Chapter 70 from year to year. And that this is because we're that much above our target of 17.5%. And we're not too unlike many other districts out there. 211 other districts in Massachusetts have also only received in fiscal 25 the minimum amount of $30 per pupil. So we're like 211 other school districts out there in Massachusetts. And this dynamic has been in place for many years. And I think because we're still that far above our target, North Reading can expect these minimum aid increases for a number of years to come in the future as well, as we predict Chapter 70 into the future. As you can see here, if you look at the Chapter 70 program, again, this is North Reading data. You can see that going back till fiscal 11, fiscal 12, we've been that far. Our actual aid percentages have been that much greater than the 17.5% target. So you can just see this scenario at play. Another way of looking at it, if you look at some local communities in the area and where they are what their Chapter 70 aid is in relation to their target. You can see that almost all these communities in this geographic area around North Reading, Wilmington, Wakefield, Reading, Stoneham are all considered wealthy communities and would be they're also target aid shares of 17.5%. That's what the first chart is telling you. The second chart here is reflecting the distance from your target aid share. So you can actually see that a community like Stoneham, Wakefield are very close to their target. And communities like North Reading, even Wilmington, and to a little bit of a lesser extent, but Reading, are much further away from their target. So again, those are communities that are receiving most likely minimum aid increases, because in the eyes of the formula, we're getting more Chapter 70 aid as a percent of our foundation budget than the formula wants us to have. So we're not going to qualify for growth aid, down payment aid, phase-in aid that the formula is looking to do, that some of these other communities that are either at target or below target are receiving. So that's an important scenario that's at play, certainly for North Reading and a lot of other communities that I think in most cases are sort of overlooked by folks that kind of look at the Chapter 70 formula and wonder if the governor and the state is initiating all these additional millions of dollars into the Chapter 70 program, like the Student Opportunities Act, why is my community not receiving large increases? And I think you need to look at where you are at in relation to your target aid share. Are you at it? Are you below it? If you are at or below, you're going to receive most likely these increases. If you are above, you're not going to qualify for a lot of that additional funding that's being put towards the Chapter 70 program. So I hope that information helps kind of clarify the Chapter 70 program here in North Reading and in the state, and how it functions. And again, it's a very sophisticated, complicated formula, and it's looking to provide kind of that base level of funding in state aid for cities and towns in Massachusetts. But there's a lot of variables and a lot at work, and it's not the easiest to understand. But I think understanding your target aid share and your actual percentage of aid compared to your foundation budget is an important component of that formula to see what's at play in your district. So I hope this was a helpful budget presentation in less than 20 minutes. We are just starting our budget process here in North Reading. We're going to be presenting the preliminary budget in the coming weeks. If you want to follow that budget process, you can go right online, and you can also follow me at Twitter. Thank you for your time today.